Ahlan wa sahlan. We are here gathered for just an informal brainstorming about the issues that are facing cities in general, and especially the loss of vernacular and historic architecture, and its also transformation. And when we look at history, we notice that this is a global problem facing most of the cities worldwide. The loss due modern urbanization, which brings expansion of cities. It also introduces the need of remodeling and transformation in all these buildings, and it introduces new technologies, and you have also the issues of war and conflict, which really can affect the situation, can affect it physically, and can affect it at the conceptual level, how people see their architecture and their spaces. And Jerusalem is facing this problem seriously too, like many areas in the in Palestine. And I would like to hear your opinions. How does it develop? How do things happen in Jerusalem, for example? How about the transformation of the cities since the colonial times of the British and after the Ottoman and till the Israeli situation? And maybe we can also talk more about possibilities of improving the situation and facing this challenge, which is a serious challenge to cities. And let's not forget, cities are not museistic exhibits, they are living entities. And this is an important challenge to all of these. What would you think about cities and how colonial space develops in our situation?
Thank you, Omar. I think talking about Palestine and particularly about Jerusalem as an emblem of the Palestinian conflict, it is difficult to understand city urbanization, public spaces, architecture, art without understanding the colonial context that created it. One of the things that we can start by taking notice of is the image of Jerusalem that we all know today. The iconic image of Jerusalem taken from the Mount of Olives, this majestic city surrounded by the historic wall, sitting in all majesty over this hill. This image was in fact created of course, through the history of the city and the people who changed over centuries. But this modern image of it today was actually something that had to do particularly with the British Mandate. If we look at the city before the British Mandate, in fact, the natural growth of the city demanded that the architectural and the urban expansion started growing outside the city walls. When the British Mandate arrived, they had a specific biblical image of the city that had to do with it being like a museum kind of situation, a museum image, an iconic image. So one of the rules that came with the pro-Jerusalem society, Ronald Storrs, as the governor of the city at that time, was how to actually, from one aspect, to remove the unprogressive image that was left by the Ottomans. This has to do with understanding the Orientalist perception of the city, and to actually create the image that came with their imagination. So one of the first rules was creating a buffer zone, destroying all the new architecture that has expanded around the city walls, and creating a green circle that encircles the whole city, and creating a buffer zone between the old city and the new modernist expansion of the city. And today this has been maintained since that rule was set. It was maintained by the Jordanian government and the city planners. It was maintained by the Israeli city planners. And it created this image of the city that we all know and we all celebrate. Even we as Palestinians, we celebrate, we manifest, and we see our city in the image that was created for us by British mandate regulations.
May I be polemic here and talk about, although they wanted to create this idealistic image, but now because of the politics and the urban politics of after the occupation of Jerusalem, like controlling demography and geography. In order to control demography, you restrict housing for the Palestinians in the area. So practically even the old city became a refuge for all the people who are looking for affordable housing. And that affected so much the typology and the technologies of building in Jerusalem. So when you look at that majestic image, you see a skyline with on which you have nice towers and domes and all the historic significant landmarks, but they are coming out of a mesh of wires, satellite dishes, TV antennas, and all these things. So how modernization and also the intention, the political intention to freeze a city doesn't usually produce a good image of that, because we say in urban planning that rules which do not respect life will definitely break them.
True. People do not follow what urban planners want. People follow what they need.
Needs of life.
And there are needs that necessitates changing and developing a city in a different way. The incremental growth of Jerusalem was a political necessity because of Jerusalemites taking refuge in the old city when their residency was under jeopardy, when their living outside of their city became a reason for them losing their right to be in their city. This has to do again with what kind of cities we want to live in and where we want to live. This is a question that has to do with who decides who we are. How do we create our image? How do we create our cities? And if we want to live in Jerusalem because we want to, it is our city, then yes, we will do whatever it takes as people of Jerusalem. But I also, this is an important aspect to understand how a city develops. But at the same time, the main thing that continues on going into my mind when I think of creating this buffer zone is how this buffer zone actually affected the livelihood of the old city, affected the economy of the old city. Today, Jerusalemites who live outside the old city, they still have a strong connection with it. But the relation is not very organic, because you need to actually take a decision to move from the outside of the old city into the old city. And I think this has to do with the fact that this natural extension, which we can see in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Cairo, in all old cities that used to have a wall, but naturally these walls disappeared with the extension of the urban space. So this is a question, I don't have the answer to it, but I always wonder, how has this actually affected the economy of the city by putting border in a way, creating an image, an imaginary border for the movement in and out of the city. That's another aspect.
I think we have to keep in mind, first of all, that we do not have a say on how to plan the city and how to plan whether the buffer zone, whether to maintain it, whether to change it, whether whatever we do inside or just outside the old city, we do, as Palestinians, as Jerusalemites, we do not have a real say in it. We have not had a say in it since 1967. This is very important. And when we do go along, I want to come back to what you said about the change in population and so on, and the demand, the overcrowdedness of the old city. Just about maybe 15 years ago, we saw a turnaround. The old city was losing a lot of its residents. I was living there, and that time I was accompanying it as a restoration engineer inside the old city. We were actually seeing a lot of houses being evacuated and people moving on to suburbs around Jerusalem, of course. And like you all both said, when the law came out that you would lose your residency, all of a sudden, almost overnight, I say overnight with a lot of exaggeration, 15,000 people living inside the old city became 30,000,
Yes.
almost doubled
Reverse migration.
within reverse migration because they needed an address to keep. So what
It
happened?
was an exodus and counter
Of
exodus.
course,
Exactly.
and that had a very destructive effect on architecture, of existing architecture, and how architecture started to transform inside the old city. Talking about the Housh, the houses, how everything was automatically cut down and
Yes.
divided into even more cubicles than before. We witnessed, before a lot of restrictions came on, we witnessed many old domes being knocked down. Old tiled domes, the beautiful symbol of, like you said, if you stand on the Mount of Olives and you see all these big domes with tiles and the beautiful old traditional architecture of that, some of them were demolished without any hesitation by engineers and by architects, just to put flat roofs to enable them to build another floor and so on, to house their families. This, I think, is the most important issue that we had to deal with. Now, during the last 20 years or so, again, the architects, local architects and historians and academians, they started to say, no, we have to stop this. Let's think back. They started to look at, put restrictions on themselves, how to work with restoration work. And really there were a lot of successful, not just attempts, results actually. And, many bodies were formed where they would do like what we label as proper restoration work. Proper meaning maintaining the old style, maintaining the old material and so on. But still, modernization is a very strong thing. Yes. And not just modernization, making serviceability requirements and so on. And serviceability has a very, very important role. Just to go briefly about this, because many of the buildings that I was involved in restoration or modernization or rehabilitation or whatever the word is, inside the old city and outside, when it came to technology, installing networks, installing new sewage lines, what networks I'm talking about, electricity, computer, low voltage things and all this stuff, and even water and so on, we were lost there, because to make it serviceable and to meet the needs of modern use, you had to make compromises, and compromises were always, the ancient style, architectural styles had to pay for that. But there were many experiences where things were successful, but this is part of the problem, I think.
Maybe we can understand it as part of the layering. I used to be quite orthodox around not touching traditional architecture. I'm more tolerant now to that aspect. If we need to build, it's okay. This is how humanity survived over centuries. They knocked down buildings and built new buildings. Yes, we need to preserve a part of our history. We need to preserve these traditions, these traditional buildings, but we need to understand also that life and living necessities will always override, will always prevail. So in a way, I'm a bit tolerant to that. I'm fine with the fact that there are new, modern, maybe we don't perceive as aesthetically working well with the traditional architecture, but this is a need that came with a condition. So maybe we can live with it. Maybe yes. we can find ways to accept it. Maybe we can find ways to propose different ways of.
I will give you a chance. It's okay. Just because what Rawan's mentioned, one of the good examples is the museum building, that the Palestinian Heritage Museum building just next door to here, because it's a 150-year-old building, but service, it's an old late Ottoman building, beautiful arches inside, outside and so on, but when a new steel and glass elevator structure and staircase was installed inside the place to make it serviceable and so on, it blended in very well with the old architecture. And I think I always use a simple term: if it's comfortable to the eye, to the human eye, if you see it comfortably, it means it blended in well.
So here we can connect both, that yes, those things enter our life, but maybe we should care for special designs and special
Yes, definitely.
consideration in order to integrate them in a positive way.
Definitely.
And not. Maybe you can give us examples of what happens in the world or whatever you think.
That's one of the things.
Yes.
It is really, as you both said, the fine line between making it a livable city and a museum. I mean, Jerusalem obviously is turning into a museum, or is turning into a tourist spot more and more. And other places like Aleppo or Fes are facing the same challenges. They all have different challenges. Mostly what happens first is people go out of the old city because they want exactly what you said. They want livable houses, they want modern houses, they want plumbing and all of that. Somebody else moves in. You have the challenge of overcrowded. Aleppo had the challenge of people wanting to move out of these old houses, beautiful old houses. So you have different challenges to face. And there comes that one point you were saying you were conservative about the restoration of old houses, and now you're kind of stepping back from that a little bit, and you're having that elevator installed. And in archaeology, we have the one discussion that we say, how are we restoring? Are we restoring that the eye sees it or you don't see it? I'm a very proponent of restoring so you can see what has been restored. And I think it's important to give the people what happened in Aleppo. Let me just quick finish that. Was that they're trying to keep the people in there. They're restoring the houses, put new plumbing in, put new electrics, and then making them livable and try to keep the old families in the old city. Otherwise, they would get bought out. You get the businesses and you get hotels, and then you get another problem. But that comes also with restoration. That comes with modernization, and that's got to be done on a very specific basis. So I find it very, very good to put things in, give them a little bit of modern styles. I'm a little bit I don't know how to handle the overcrowding. Actually, that's really a tough thing, and you don't even have only the overcrowding of the housings. You have the overcrowding of the traffic and everything.
Yeah.
It makes it very, very hard for people wanting to live there. Still, they have to live there, but like as
serious social consequences.
Right.
It's
and that makes it really hard to
justify
justify keeping buildings in that old style as they are. But then again, you have to somehow. You can't let them run down. And that's one of the things I don't have an answer to in Jerusalem. That's kind of interesting. In Fes, it was another thing that made it into kind of like a museum, and then they shut off the quarters besides that. So they had really residential quarters, but you can move through there. And it's very touristic in the middle, and then you have the quarters in there. And in Aleppo, they made it a living old quarter, which was quite well. But here, you still have the side streets. But I have the impression that the tourist life, or that life, really goes much more in it, and you have a lot more change. You mentioned the antennas, the dishes, and everything. You can see that, but I would really hear a solution to that. I don't see one. That's kind of it's so complex. And then you have that museum in there. You have the archaeology in there. People want to see archaeology. Worst thing for archaeology are tourists. How do you keep that out of there? So that's for me is the very important thing. That all those cities face the same changes, but they're so different. The solutions are so different, and the one solution I don't see now is Jerusalem, the old city. And what I see today is the many tourists. Don't you have to cut it down somewhere? Can you really have that? Can you widen up the streets? How can you bring them in, and how do you have that? And then the other thing is the integration. That's an interesting thing. The integration, that artificial border you have out there. That's true. You don't have that in other cities. You don't have that in Aleppo. Fes actually has that too. You have that old city, and it just breaks off. Then you have a little bit of Jewish quarter, the old one, and then you have that new city, and it's a cultural border, and it's different people living in a social border. You have that your housings out there. You have the hotels out there. They have that too, but it's grown. It's grown there. It's grown also mandate times. It's grown under the colonization, the bandit, and that's for me that's the important part, how to find that fine line you have there.
In this area, I would like to re-bring the issues which you brought, all of you, and try to weave them again. Like, life is more important than regulations. I agree, and we should accept that life is going on, and the city is a living entity, a living organism even. But for example, I don't have a problem with the flat roofs which developed after the earthquake in 27, where people, instead of rebuilding the cross vaults, found it easier. At that time, we were having the railway steel,
construction.
so we were able to make flat roofs. And that was quick, that was realistic, that was done without any obligation. It wasn't a forced situation, at least. It was a quick remedy. And now I would consider it even as part of our historic heritage.
True.
It documents a historic situation, and it shows a certain solution which came out of it's more the industrialization which brought us this steel and made it easy possible. Maybe my problem with today's crowding and that issue, that it's somehow forced by a political issue of urban planning. And we also say that urban planning is an operational tool of power. Like when we are in FAS, you don't have a real contradiction between the needs of the people and the governing or entities or institutions that are trying to revitalize and develop the area. Here we have an awkward situation, an Israeli government which freezes everything, so it doesn't even leave windows for development, for self-organization, for finding solutions, like you said.
We don't have a say.
We are outsiders and we just look at the situation. Where our social conditions force us to go into the old city. And in Silwan, for example, Silwan is another hill. It's near the archaeological spaces of Old Jerusalem. And because of the even political conflict, the fabrication of identity, nationality, belonging, it brings archaeology against the needs of everyday life. And that really destroys the areas instead of alleviating them and creating that very nice
makes one helpless.
Creative
You
image.
you're helpless. You don't know what to do, really.
Yeah.
I think this also brings back, you brought back the colonial aspect, which is quite important in understanding cities and the development of the cities, particularly in Jerusalem. And whether it's urban planning, whether it's architecture, whether it's archaeology or art in that sense, these are all tools, in a way, that have been utilized by different political agendas to forward certain narratives over other narratives, or to put to the front, to create certain identities. So the example that I brought from the pro-Jerusalem Society and the Ronald Stores and the British Mandate, and then that followed, that came also in the same time when an institution like the Bezalel Art school, which is the first Zionist art school established in Palestine in 1906. These were institutions that collaborated to put regulations and to construct a national Zionist identity to the prospect Israeli state. So it was part of a modernist nation state construction of identity, and the image of this the state was important. The image of this new nation state was important. So architecture was utilized in this aspect. Art was utilized in this aspect, and archaeology, of course, is a major tool in this aspect. And it actually brought in three main aspects to construct this image. One, the biblical references, through which we can understand the museumization of Jerusalem and glorifying it as the Zion, the Yerushalayim in a way, and the local aspect, because the Zionist narrative needed to find roots in this place. So they did utilize whatever local crafts, local arts were already in this place to contribute to creating the Zionist identity, and the modernist aspect, the European modernist line. So there were three lines that were actually weaved together to contribute to constructing this kind of identity. And this is important for us understanding Jerusalem today and understanding how this have developed over the past century to reach us to this day, when we are still fighting for ownership of our space that has been appropriated, conceptually appropriated, materially. It was actually taken away. And then what is our role today as Palestinians living in Jerusalem in finding ways of creating our spaces in our city, reclaiming our ownership of our public spaces, of how we want our city to look like. And that comes maybe
I think I have sort of, I don't want to say an answer, but because I did recommend something like this, an idea related to this, to finding sort of a solution, at least a serious attempt at finding a solution to how to deal with these things. You mentioned just now that you don't know how to deal with this, and we all don't know how to deal with it. As time went by, when we were doing restoration work, intensive restoration work, both inside and outside the old city, I did start to see, always hear conflicting ideas and concepts from different architects, engineers, whatever. My background is engineering, so I'm not an architect, but we always used to deal with codes of practice, the steel design code of practice, reinforced concrete code of practice, and so on. You have actually codes of practice. So I did suggest at one time, and we tried to find something like that for creating our own code of practice for dealing with restoration work in its all broadness. This would need a lot of work, very, very, very serious work that would take into account, archaeology, architecture, history, restraints by the authorities, by the occupation authorities, everything, the needs of the people and so on. And then maybe we can start with just a small attempt to put sort of guidelines, mini guidelines for a mini code of practice that would, provide direction, at least for the junior architects who are put in. Like, for example, just a few months ago, I was called in to help a school in the Christian Quarter. They were going to, Terasanta School, they're going to build a swimming pool. A swimming pool inside the old city, which is great, it's a great thing. Some of the architects are junior, the people dealing with this, so they would need direction, they would need guidelines, some form of guidelines how to go into this. This is just a small example, because we're always coming across things like that. The other day we went to a new cultural center that was opened only recently. It looked beautiful on the surface, but they were missing on so many things, because again, they did not know how to, something, they didn't have a tool to guide them how to do the proper restoration work in all its complexities. And so maybe this is just a small idea that we need to find guidelines in some sort of a code of, not necessarily called code of practice, but really all your ideas, everything that's been said, everything, all the thoughts in our minds. There are many organizations today that do perform a lot of intensive, like Ta'awun and people like that, and their architects are experts now, but again, they lose track many times because of the different cases that they face. So something has to be put by us, Palestinian, Jerusalemite architects, historians.
Do you have any examples, for example?
Sorry?
Do you have any examples, certain rules which you would...
Well, actually, one of the best examples that I saw when I first started working with the Islamic Archaeology Department about 30 years ago, I came into something called the Center for Maintenance of Old Buildings in the Old City. There was a group of archaeologists, like Dr. Natche and 3 archaeologists actually, 3 architects specialized in restoration work, about 12 draftsmen. And this was all in-house, all staff of the same center. They operated for maybe, I wasn't part of them, but at the end, after a few years, I became one of their consultants. And they even had their own laborers, their own equipment. They used to bring the big pieces of stone. They used to get this archaeological study about it, then give it to the architects, then give it to the draftsmen to draw, then give it to the people who do the stones and so on. And maybe 10 or 12 major Mamluk buildings were restored in that way, and it was a beautiful process, purely scientific, effective, and that was in a way a code of practice.
we noticed that we usually nations succeed in renovating and preserving the important buildings which are more official buildings. Our problem is usually with the residential areas.
That's true.
Yeah.
Which face that, and now
Yeah.
the whole thing, remodeling and transformation, lets us lose also the typologies which you mentioned, like the Palestinian Housh is now, because of the many people who want to live in it, maybe this is not faced in face because people are leaving the city. In our case, it's a counter exodus because of the politics. So you have, before you had one bathroom and one kitchen in that house, and all of a sudden it's inhabited by 4 people, and you have 4 bathrooms, 4 kitchens, which clot the interior space. The problem is with the residential usually, and I want to like to go now into the direction of maybe positive possibilities. So I would, can I sum up and say your suggestion is like document the older techniques and train the people on them, because we also losing the mashrabiyas which were wooden.
Yeah.
Now you have maybe metal boxes or things like that. I don't know if you have any ideas into the direction how can we improve the situation. What
I
is
do have
done in
one fun fact for the thing. That thing of parting of houses, you can actually see that in Abbasid Samara. You can see that in other Abbasid towns. So it's actually a process that happened hundreds of years ago.
Yes.
So it happens. So you lose some of that thing. It divides. But I see the problem. But it's a process that just happens in those cities. One thing I find very, very important is what you just said. You have to remind how to produce these things. And I think it's very important to build up workplaces, workspaces. People learn that. You have to teach those people. The German, I think now they're calling them the GI said, GT said formally, they did that in Aleppo for a huge amount of time, and they controlled it. So you had a kind of a setup. So you need a central institution, more or less, or at least a place where people can go and say, hey, how do I do that? How do I do the wood carvings? How do I do that? How did that really look?
The skills.
And then we come in, also you come in as heritage personnel, and we come in as archaeologists and can tell you that's how it worked, that's how they did it, that's how you get it restored. We're at the lower end when it comes to the older buildings, but I think this is the most important thing you can do, is to really, really deliver those techniques, deliver the handicraft up to the generations to come. And the problem I would see now for my own country is that there's just no money in it. And that's probably the same thing. We're facing the same problems. Everybody gets pushed out. You take a firm doing it, you know, 3rd and 2nd level, and but I might go to Fes again. There's a handicraft school actually in the town. They're teaching it, and that's important to keep those people there and to have the not only the rules but also the abilities. I just been to Hebron with somebody from the AA, and we saw a reconstruction of a building, and the people working there did their best job, but it was just really it didn't work. They were spray painting a wooden door that was already installed. You can't do that, but it's not. You don't blame it onto those people. They just don't know it any better. And that's I think a point where one can
and sometimes it's
kind of push and nudge it. But sometimes it's just not people don't realizing what they want because
they don't have the skill, and
they're building a living quarter. They're not reconstructing, and you have workmen that are they do great houses and they're proud of the work they do, and they do it for people living there, and that's okay. But on the other hand, one might be able to nudge in and teach people how to do it, and
so maybe we are talking about awareness building, which is another aspect.
Build awareness.
Build awareness. Teach the people that it's important.
I just want to mention one point that we always have to keep in mind regarding the old city and the residential areas, is that we have a very serious complication regarding property ownership. Property ownership, the waqf, the family waqf, the things. Property ownership in residential buildings inside the old city is one of the major obstacles, no less important, and it has the same weight as the problems and restraints of the authorities. This is a very complicated issue. There's no time and space. It's not the scope of us, but for this meeting. But I think anybody who wants to deal with this issue has to keep this thing in mind.
True.
I
It's
think
very
it's very
complicated.
important,
It's very
and it's also
important, yes.
political.
It's totally
Because if
political.
it's a
extremely
Palestinian government, you would explain the situation and it will be accepted. But because of the Israeli rules,
Outsiders
you
don't
will
know
be
this
exactly that. Yeah, they think that we are a normal society, and this is the abnormality of Jerusalem. And another issue which I would like to jump out of the old city, I thought of it. Lifta now is in Jerusalem. It's maybe the only village in
Untouched,
Palestine
in a way.
which you can see untouched. Even the villages in the West Bank, because like we said, life expands
they
and it
expanded,
grows, so you don't have many buildings which are intact. But because of the war, I don't want to say yani, thanks God, no, but it was frozen, and at least you have the typology of a village,
The
and this is
landscape
now
is the same,
even
yeah.
threatened.
Understood.
The Israelis are really planning a housing project for wealthy millionaires.
Oh, really?
Yes, and they talk in their plan. They talked about preserving the village and things like that. But I don't see how can you preserve it. This is because this is a very important issue. I think we should all stand to support the preservation of the village and stopping that project. And it's not known a lot. There has been an exhibition done about it, but the situation is critical. So sometimes also how everyday life can impinge on things, or the phenomenon of gentrification, where the wealthy come to such areas, and I don't know if they alleviate them, they may destroy them.
This is something to think about.
In any way, they won't keep it in the way you would actually want to have it, because it's such a special place. It's, you said,
Exactly.
it's frozen in time. And
So,
Okay, now we talked about the old city and the historical heritage, but maybe we should also look at our heritage, not just in the very old buildings. For example, although some areas will talk about modern architecture as their heritage, we have also a modern history.
yeah, of
The
course,
cinema,
very
the
rich.
cinemas were something very interesting in the area, and although we meant it well, but as we renovated Cinema Al Hamra, I believe we destroyed it. It was an example of rational design, straight lines, and it was maybe the first curtain wall in Jerusalem. All of a sudden we have on it stuck an arch, which I don't know from where does it come, and all these aspects of postmodern architecture which try to, in a silly way, decorate something and put something which doesn't belong to
Yeah.
it. So I believe we are facing the situation. I'm sure this is maybe a bad example, but I'm sure we have good examples.
Yeah.
So can we chat about how do we deal
I
with the
think,
situation and where we can...
The owner was confused in that case. He brought in a design because I was involved in the latter stages of construction of
okay.
that. I was the project manager there after they did the
So you are the...
No,
You're
I came involved in after they did the main architectural features that you were talking
Okay.
about and the part of the interior division. But I think that the owner was really confused. He wanted to do something nice. He brought the designs from somewhere from outside. I don't know where. He didn't do them here, and from America actually.
Although I thought it's a local office.
No. The local offices just did the supervision of construction, really,
Okay.
and the service and the electromechanical works and sound and insulation
This
and
is
things
a
like
double
that.
disaster. First
Yeah.
of all, you
And then
don't
he
employ
started-
your architects, and then you bring...
As he started working with it, he
Bad
kept
designs.
changing his mind every day almost. You know, with new
Interesting.
requirements related to what he sees in it. But that was a relatively bad example, like you said, in terms of restoration work. Because during the 50s and 60s, I think we have a lot of buildings outside the
Yes.
city walls, even in West Jerusalem. Really
And in
beautiful
Bet Hanina
ones.
Road.
And in
We
Bet
have
Hanina,
some
the
excellent
ones on the
modernist
road,
examples.
we have at least, 20 or 30 really beautiful houses,
Yes.
villas, if you want to call them, that were modern and they still are nice. I was very happy just a couple of months ago when I saw one of we call it the Armenian house where my uncle used to live before 1967. and it was restored. They left it, really in bad shape for maybe 30, 40 years. It was restored. I stopped outside. I took some photographs. I
Great.
sent them to my cousins in Amman, and I was really happy about it. So there were many buildings like that built in during the same time. But if you want to go back just a few more years to 100 years ago, to go back to the example that we mentioned when we were talking informally, like Dar Asaf Nashashibi, the palace, what we call the Palace of Asaf Nashashibi in Sheikh Jarrah. 100 years ago it was built, and about 10 years ago we did some restoration work, rehabilitation work. I think we were confused. The architect, even though he's a specialized restorer, he was confused, and we as a team, we were not able to deal with balancing the modernization, serviceability, and keeping the old. This is why I said there's a need for a code of practice. For example, all the timber, the wood, doors and windows, they were all old and they were kept the same. They're not good for use. They're very
Yes.
It's disastrous. We need to decide amongst ourselves, the experts, let's say, what in such a situation, when we want to turn it into a cultural center, what should we do with these windows? We kept the tiles, the old marble Carrara tiles from 100 years ago. Some of it was cracked. We replaced it and so on. But in general, and there was a serious effect from the earthquake of 2007, I think. Was it 2007? Because it was a library. There were lots of cracking. We had to empty out all the library and do some reinforced concrete strengthening and so on. So this, I think, if we study that case, it's a very big project and a very unique case. And one of it was mentioned in a book it came out just a couple of years ago. The same architect who did buildings at the entrance of Shara Yafa of Jaffa Street as well. It was, it's a very rich and very well known building that is worth making a case study of, to
Yes.
teach, to learn, and to educate about it.
Can I ask, when did you do the renovation?
About 10 years ago.
Okay. I want to start from that point, because I think, and to connect with what Dr. Omar was saying, I think there was some sort of a wave 10 years ago on doing rehabilitation. So
Especially in the cultural side.
Exactly. Asaf Nashashibi building, Al Hamra cinema with the disastrous results. And there were there were other examples, like Al Quds cinema turning into Yabous Cultural Center,
Edward Said,
Edward Said, which was
Dar Shabi.
Dar Shabi, Shabi House, which was turned into Edward Said National Conservatory of Music. So there was some sort of a wave.
Trend.
And I think we need to try to understand why and how this trend happened, and to connect again with the concept of heritage, because I think one of the questions we need to start: what is heritage? When does it start? Where is there a year that breaks what's before it is heritage, what's after it is worthless in terms of our history and culture? So I think this is a major question in our perceptions of things. So to continue on the issue of urbanization outside the city walls, I also think we need to understand it in terms of the division of the city. So the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, for example, developed in the late Ottoman early Mandate period as part of the expansion outside the city, exactly like the western part of Jerusalem. In 1948, the city was divided, and then in 1967, it was again...
Don't say reunited.
Of course not. Of course not. But it was again...
Connected in a way.
It was connected. It was
way,
occupied, and it became connected. What's interesting to understand the wave of the new renovations is to try to look what happened from 1967 until today. Mm-hmm. And just looking at maps, you can see the huge difference, like massive difference, between how the western part of the city has developed, the modernity, the roads, the facilities, the services, the urban services, the infrastructure, and how the eastern part of the city, the Palestinian, the 1967 part of the city, was stagnated, completely stagnated. and looking at, for example, because we did a study as part of a project that I was involved in a few years ago, we did a study on the commercial area in East Jerusalem, which is Salah ad-Din Street and the Zahra Street. And literally the maps from 1967 and the maps from today almost are typical. The expansion is very, very, very minimal. The development is very minimal. And I think this is very indicative. This says a lot about the how the cities grow, the relationship with colonization, the relationship with occupational regulations and rules, and then how we as residents of the city react to this. I think the wave of renovations,
how we fight back,
came as a way of fighting back, a way of trying to recreate our space, to maintain it, to reclaim it. This can also be understood from that aspect. It's not only a renovation; it's actually a political statement. It's a claim of our buildings and of our spaces.
Definitely.
Of course, we can question how successful was that, given all the odds that Palestinians in Jerusalem were against.
Despite everything, we have been successful to a solid. We fought back as to the best of our abilities. We did fight back inside the old city and outside. I think as much as we could.
I appreciate looking at buildings and considering them cases of success. What I always so like to consider is looking at them as part of the texture of the fabric of the city.
Yeah.
One of the things that really concerns me a lot in the Zahra Street neighborhood, Karmel Khalili or the Rockefeller Park, which has been recently, over the past 3 years, renovated by the Israeli municipality. And what concerns me particularly is how new visual elements have been introduced into this space to make it look more like the Israeli settlement kind of public spaces. So there's this kind of establishing this connection to sort of create a new identity for these places.
Well,
I think this is very
careful here.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm a controversial architect. In these considerations, is it looks like Israeli, or this is the global look of play areas and all
we
these
tend
things?
to
Because it
associate
looks like a
modern
space
with
which
Israeli.
I know in Berlin.
Okay.
It looks like a space which I saw in California, because and I'm a designer of also public spaces and roofs and play areas and things like that. Sometimes I think we should see also us part of the global development anyway, if we want or not. Like you said, this is life. And I know it can touch us in certain points, or those like Rawabi looks like a settlement. Yeah, that's true. Even other suburbs in Amman look like a settlement. It's not because they look like a settlement, because this is the new modern mass production of housing. If you want to make mass production, they will look the same.
Yeah.
You can put arches on it, but the eye really catches it. Our eyes, and it says these 1,000 units were built in 6 months, while 1,000 units in the old city or in a village has been built in 500 years. So there is something generic in the aesthetics, which is more historical, more accumulative, more piecemeal growth. And even if we as designers, let's sit and design a new city for 20,000 people or 40,000 people. Whatever we do, I'm afraid, although I'm an architectural designer, I'm afraid it will look like all those modern things.
That's what Germany did after the war.
Yeah.
All those huge settlements. Let's call them settlements.
Yeah.
It was.
They are human settlements. We have a political problem
Frankfurt,
with it
Berlin,
now.
all those Dresden, they were bombed out.
Neighborhoods,
They had to
new
have
neighborhoods.
housings as fast as soon as
Yes.
possible, and they built. And we're talking Bauhaus here. It's quick. It's well built, kind of well built, and it had to be quick, and it had to be cheap, and it had to still work. And they all look the same. It's true. It's just a form that it's given by practicality, and that moves into these things, and then it looks like it.
Yes.
I think that belongs to the Pamphlesfest that has been written into the city, and it's been written out of it. And we're going back to heritage. It's also part of the heritage. I mean, in Germany, there's the buildings are sometimes very, very ugly, and you look at those streets and you go, oh, really, like 2 kilometers of these blocks, really? But it's part of it. Even so, in Eastern Germany, you had that, the concrete plate buildings and all that, and you get that here. I mean, you get a housing crisis, and you build these things outside, and it's part of the heritage too. Only that. We're talking about heritage, and I think they should be part of it too, because still it's not a dead city, and it's a living city. And I as an archaeologist, we have all these cities on top of each other, or you look at buildings where they're built with stone, they move and they reshape, and that's actually the interesting thing. There's nothing more boring than one strata city. So I think that is a very, very important thing to really take these things in, but maybe with a little bit more look for the eye, a little bit more. You don't have to put arches on everything.
Exactly.
And architecture can still be a good thing.
And we can have modern architecture.
Sure.
I think you have to.
Why shouldn't we have modern architecture?
Of course. And it's part of the heritage. We heard before the discussion of Bauhaus 100 years.
Right.
All of a sudden, it's part of the heritage. It's modernity.
We have the skill. We have the know-how. Everything.
I think it's even more
we
horrible
can.
if you
don't
try to
have to stick
remodel.
to.
So in 50 years we will consider Kufar Aqab as a model of.
I think we should.
Let's not touch Kufar. Let's not go to Kufar Aqab.
That's true. I think I would keep a couple of cities.
Hudud al-Arnona.
And this is in itself a socio-political concept.
Absolutely.
And it should show its examples.
Absolutely.
I believe city is a social product. It reflects our history.
Yeah.
I think
Like
it's great
Eastern
when you
Europe,
walk
maybe,
on cities.
for
That's
example.
a good example for that's a good advantage for architects. You can read cities. I love to walk in cities around 12 o'clock in the midnight, where no cars, and just look at the buildings. I see a lot.
Tells
I
a
see
lot about the
history.
way
I
of
see
life.
culture. I see influences.
life of
In
people.
Ramallah, for example, you see corners which are rounded. This came through modernity. If you want
Yeah, of
Bauhaus,
course.
or even the car culture, where you see even in the States, those rounded buildings, tank stations where you have gasoline, and sometimes like you say, on the highway you have stops where you can have something to eat.
The diners.
The diners,
They're also
exactly.
in the modern way,
and when I look at Ramallah and the connection of immigrants to the States and modernity and those things, so I think it's an interesting mixture, and we should look at it as a continuum.
Of course.
And even here, I would use what we heard before about the aesthetics of ugliness. That's why, for example, in my designs, even I don't say that I'm inspired by great palaces of Islam. On the contrary, I say I'm inspired by Silwan, which is a crazy amalgamation of forms, and the refugee camps. Even in my presentations, when I tilt walls and make the patches, I want to talk also about our real culture, which even under difficulties, even under occupation, even under marginalization and neglect, we should find an identity which also talks about us. So through patching the buildings, I was thinking, at least for myself, that I'm creating a culture of an architecture of hope, that although you are fragmented, although you are broken, gather your pieces, stand up and go on. So I try sometimes to transform this chaos into an energy. And when I look at Silwan and I see the refugee camp, although it's ugly, but it's really an architecture of vitality. I called it even aesthetics of survivalism. We won't stop. Life goes on. And I don't know if anybody wants to add something in that area before summing up. I think
Maybe
we
you
had
can call it a construction of new aesthetics.
I agree.
Aesthetic is what is aesthetic? Who
Exactly. It
defines
shouldn't be beautiful
what's
aesthetics.
beautiful, what's ugly? So it's a constructing
Yeah.
new terms, new references for aesthetics, which is fine because this is what we do as
think
human
this
beings.
is-
We
we
create
agree.
the spaces
Yeah.
that we need to live in, and
I
if
think
that's
we
what we
agree.
need, that's
Then
beautiful
it's
enough.
heritage, and then
it's
you
heritage.
go back to the
It
heritage,
becomes heritage,
discussion
totally.
because
So-
that reflects your life and reflects your outer. You know, you get the intrinsic things, and you get things coming from outside, and
Yeah.
that's exactly. I think that's a nice idea you just had there.
Thank you for all your contributions. I'm really very happy that we can also come up with certain points which give us hope. I would say documenting our history and architecture is important. Maybe for institutions, even I would extend that to schools of architecture. I would say training is a very important issue, which in order to keep those and to keep what is relevant and useful for the lives of the people. I think creating and building awareness becomes also a duty for us. Although we live in Jerusalem under a system an Israeli system which discriminates against the Palestinians, and in spite of the marginalization, neglect, and lack of development, we should claim our space and our ability to work, even if we don't have codes of practice from them. I think we should sit up between us with experts which we trust and which understand our situation. I think we need to make consultations, wide consultations, and re-evaluation of the experience, which we showed that in our experience we have good examples and we have some faults. And I like the idea of developing a Palestinian code of practice, which is practically, even if we cannot liberate territory, but I think we need to liberate ourselves from the constraints of even just being a victim and just reacting. It would be important for us also to look some space in the future. I think because of our victimization, we notice that Israel plays chess because it's the powerful. We play ping pong. I believe we need to also train ourselves to play more chess in this situation.
Agreed. Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks all of you for the great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.